Paul has done a lot of great work in a lot of different places. And he feels convicted by God that he needs to go to Jerusalem. And he's going in haste because he's trying to make it by the Pentecost, by the Festival of Tabernacles. And when he gets there, he checks in with the church, and the church there is kind of like, hey, this is the church in Jerusalem, hey, look, we know you're cool, but there's a lot of people who say that you have been preaching against Moses and against being Jewish. And we just need you to establish your street cred, that you actually are, in fact, a godly man who obeys the law and who has not rejected the law. So he takes a few guys to the temple to help pay their expenses as they wrap up some vows. And at the temple, people who had been making his life miserable abroad, well, guess what? They had come to Jerusalem too, also to celebrate the Pentecost. And they see him, and they start a riot, basically. And he gets arrested, even though the officials there don't know what he's done wrong. So he's being kept in these barracks. And let me see where we left off. So Paul asks, this was Acts 22, Paul asks to make an appeal to his, to the Jewish people so he can make his case. He says, I am as Jewish as anyone, maybe more Jewish than most of you guys. I'm a Pharisee. I studied under Gamaliel. Right? He goes on to lay out his pedigree, and he goes on to tell him about his conversion experience and how God told him that he would go and bring the good news to the Gentiles. People lose it. They go crazy. So the Roman authorities who came to break up the riot, because they said, look, if you guys keep this up, Caesar's going to hear about it, and he's going to come put the hammer down, right? So he goes back inside, and he's being kept, inside. And Paul says, I'm a Roman citizen. I can't be whipped and flogged and all that stuff. I have my citizenship from my father. And so the Romans are at a bit of a crossroads because these people are demanding punishment for Paul, but he hasn't broken any Roman laws. And the Romans can't figure out why they're so mad at Paul, because it's just, in their mind, it's just philosophy. He's just saying words that they don't like. So they're trying to get the Jewish people to sort it out themselves. So that brings us up to where we're at today. We're going to finish up chapter 22. I've only got one verse left, and then we're going to move forward. On the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. So I think I've mentioned this last week, but I'm going to bring it up again this week just as a point of comparison. You remember, I've told you the big theme of the book of Acts is these are people who are learning to live and even die like Jesus, right? Loving their neighbor, loving their enemy, right? We saw in Stephen an example of someone who learned to die like Jesus. We see with Paul similar things going on. Remember last week, they were looking for people to bring accusations against him, and they couldn't get two people to agree on the accusations, just like the trial of Jesus. And again, just like Paul goes before Pilate, and Pilate's like, what are you even doing here? I don't understand what's going on right now. What did you do that made these people so angry? And that's the same thing that the Roman tribune is dealing with right now. He's like, I don't understand this. Why are they so angry with you? So he's trying to get to the bottom of it. So he's calling together the Jewish leadership, right? Acts 23. So they brought the council together. Acts 23. Looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." Let's pause on that for a moment. Was Paul always a Christian? When he wasn't, was he still living with what he thought was a good conscience? So as he was out there persecuting the Christians, he did so feeling that his conscience was clear, feeling zealous for God, right? He was doing those things that he thought were well-pleasing to God. I don't think what he's saying here is that he has no regrets, right? Because I think, if you look, when he looks back in hindsight, I think he's greatly grieved over his sins. Last week we read from one of the epistles where Paul says, "All that stuff that I had accounted as gain, I now count as loss." Right? All the things I thought were assets, I now look at as liabilities for the sake of Christ. But he can still say, "I've always lived in good conscience," meaning I have always followed what I thought the will of God was. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Does that seem like a high priestly action to you? All right, let's keep going. There's a little bit of a question about what comes next, so we'll just bring it up and deal with it. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck?" Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" Okay. What just happened there?
Showing respect for the same people, those in the same people,
Maybe. Yeah.
or for their traditions.
Yeah. So the high priest orders him struck, and Paul calls him a whitewashed wall, which might recall in your mind the words of Jesus where he called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs, right? Because they were fine looking on the outside and dead on the inside, right? This word of Paul isn't quite as severe, but it's pretty harsh, right? You look fine on the outside, but whitewashed wall. You're obstructive. You're dense, right? What's that?
You're fake.
Fake. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this the same Ananias that gave Paul his sight?
No, not the same Ananias. No, they had the same problem in their day that we have in our day, which is a lot of people had the same names, right? That's why every time a Judas comes up, Judas was a real common name, but, in the Bible, every time some other Judas comes up, he's like, Judas, not Iscariot, okay? Yeah, no, not the same Ananias who gave him his sight. Good question, though. He calls him a whitewashed wall, saying that you're trying to judge me by the law, and yet you have broken the law as I stand here in your presence. And they say, "How dare you speak to the high priest like this?" And when I read this, I wonder, Well, doesn't Paul know he's the high priest? Now, as I always do in preparation for this stuff, I read through some commentaries to try and give me some, because I'm not a professional historian. I'm a professional pastor, so I don't have all of the resources on hand that other people might. So I think there's a couple things that could be happening here. One, it's possible that in this setting, the high priest was not wearing his high priestly garments, which he would have only had on when he was doing, official duties. And so maybe that would be a reason why Paul might not know that he's a high priest. I also read that it's possible that they were just rotating through high priests so fast that Paul had never seen this guy occupying the office of high priest before. That they rotated every couple of years, or maybe even more frequently than every year, which was not like the way God set it up. It just kind of goes to show how corrupt and political the whole thing had become. So that's possible too. When I read this and I hear him call this guy a whitewashed tomb or a whitewashed wall, that whitewashed accusation, that seems to suggest the guy has a cheap and false glory about his exterior. You know what I mean? I think he might know that it's the high priest. If he did, would that color your interpretation of these words? I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.
I get them mixed up too. Ananias, Anna,
Okay?
different ones.
Jim?
Could he be insinuating that he's not acting like a high priest?
I think definitely he could be insinuating that. And I think knowing what we know about the Christian faith, you could even go farther. Who is the high priest?
Ananias was the top one.
No, he wasn't. Not in Paul's mind. We have one great high priest who makes intercession for us, Jesus. Now, I don't know if that's what Paul's saying, okay? But I think there's a very good chance that it is. And you could compare the conduct of those two high priests, this Ananias who orders somebody who says something he doesn't like to be struck in the mouth, and Jesus who himself never raised a hand against anyone. And he was indeed struck. One of these, day in and day out, is offering sacrifices that are not pleasing to God. The other offered one sacrifice sufficient for all humanity. So, I don't know. I don't know for sure if this is just, Paul's popping off because he's angry and didn't realize who he was talking to. Maybe. But I kind of wonder, especially because it's included here in this way, is Paul not testifying to something greater? Is Paul not testifying to a real high priest who conducts himself in a high priestly fashion? All right. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other part Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of a Sadducee. It is now with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." See, he looked out on the crowd, and you could see some of them were wearing red ties, and some of them were wearing blue ties. He was like, "Guys, I'm a red tie guy." Let's keep reading, and then we'll dig in. Okay. Brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Is this true? Is this true? What are you saying? Is he on trial because of his hope in the resurrection? He never brought Gentiles into the temple, though.
They were there and they associated with
These are people who were there from Asia Minor. People who made his life miserable apart from Jerusalem. People who opposed the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's absolutely on trial because he keeps preaching the resurrection of Christ. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? Listen how inflammatory their defense is. They're throwing in the face of the Sadducees things the Sadducees don't believe in. And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers, go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, I love that, the facts about me, so you will testify also in Rome. We'll come back to the words of God here in a moment. Let's just talk about this whole thing, this whole kerfuffle. In the Gospels, it tends to be the Pharisees that we read about as primary antagonists of Jesus, right? We're always hearing about the Pharisees and Jesus speaking against the Pharisees, how they have this seeming righteousness that's no righteousness at all, right? Sadducees come up somewhat, but not that much. When you get to the book of Acts, it's the Sadducees much more that are antagonists. Why might that be? Resurrection. Exactly right. Now, it's worth knowing that the Sadducees were the controlling party in Jerusalem, right? The high priest was a Sadducee, at least early in the book. I think probably now as well. So when Jesus is resurrected and the guards that were at the tomb come and report it to the high priest says, let's just say that they stole his body. Here's some money. Go away. Right? Faced with the reality from witnesses who were reluctant witnesses, the high priest would rather hold his position of theological correctness, and more importantly, his position of power, than admit to the greatest miracle that ever happened. Well, it is this constant message about the resurrection of Christ and the power of the resurrection and the promise of the resurrection for you. All these things, the Sadducees can't cope with that. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in spirits. How are they going to believe in the Holy Spirit? What they believe in is the law. That's what they believe in. It's a shallow husk of what faith in God is meant to be, right? Okay.
Verse 11 kind of speaks to what you were saying.
Yes.
About, Paul witnessing, because the Lord told him you witnessed.
Yes. I love this because if you remember back with me over the last few weeks, Paul's telling his friends, I love you, goodbye, I'm going to Jerusalem. And all these people are saying, don't go to Jerusalem, it's not going to go well for you. And you get people who are prophesying, God told me, if you go to Jerusalem, you will be arrested. If you go to Jerusalem, you will have pain and suffering. And Paul's like, yeah, I know, I talked to God too. I gotta go, right? So he's gone. And he's done what he came to do, right? Which is to say, he stood up. Why was he out of Jerusalem for so long? We got this a couple weeks ago in our Bible study, but I'm going to ask you, why was he out of Jerusalem for so long? Just think about what you know about his life. Okay, so on the positive side, he was out there spreading the gospel. But also, he was not able to minister in Jerusalem because of the baggage he carried with him. This is what Paul said God said to him, right? You won't be able to minister in Jerusalem. I'm going to send you to these other places. So Paul's been away for all this time because of all that baggage he carried. You asked me about Ananias, right? You remember when he gets to Damascus and God tells Ananias, I need you to go find Saul and heal him. Ananias' first response was, you don't mean Saul, right? Like, that guy is the enemy. Obviously, for someone like Saul, now Paul, to come back converted, and not just, and see, I think this is really important for us to keep in mind. It's not just that, like, he had a change of heart and immediately started telling everybody in Jerusalem about it. He spent years upon years of preaching the gospel and suffering for the gospel. And this is really important. Sometimes there are media figures, whether they're mainstream media or independent media, who will change their political position, right? Maybe they used to be conservative and now they're progressive, or maybe they used to be progressive and now they're conservative. By the way, you usually only get to make that switch once and have people still listen to you. If you make the switch again, then it's like, well, this guy doesn't stand for anything. But whenever that happens, people will often accuse them of, like, well, you're just trying to go where the crowd is, or you're just trying to follow the money, or you're just whatever, right? That accusation doesn't work against Paul, because he's making the switch, and his reward, on the surface at least, is suffering after suffering after suffering. He loses wealth, right? He's locked up, he's shipwrecked, he's whipped, all that kind of stuff. And he keeps at it, and he keeps at it. So now that he's got years of suffering for Christ under his belt, now God says, okay, you can go talk about me in Jerusalem. Yep.
According to that,
What's that?
according to the map here, Paul spent 22 years before he got to Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, he's, sometimes he camps out for like 3 years in a place before moving on, or a year and a half. And there were no jumbo jets or anything, so travel took time too. So he's put the reps in, and he has credibility now, the kind of credibility you get through suffering, not the kind of credibility you get through easy living, right? So God says, okay, you've been here, you've done the thing, which is you've stood up and testified to the resurrection and to the change that I've brought to you. And you have told them that this Jesus that I sent is for the whole world. But you're not done yet. Yeah, Jerusalem was bad, but it's time for you to go to Rome now. This is a one-way ticket, by the way. Paul knows it. All right, so God says, just as you've testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, I love that, so you must testify also in Rome. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who had made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and were ready to kill him before he comes near." Okay. I want you to hover on this for a moment. These men have taken an oath. Who are they pledging themselves to? Who are they making the oath with? Mm-mm. When a Jewish person swears an oath, they're not swearing it to each other. Yes, these guys are swearing to God that they will kill Paul. You know, it should give you pause when the chief priest orders you to punch somebody in the mouth, right? It's always, whenever you think you're doing the right thing, but you got to do it in the wrong ways, you ought to pause and carefully ask, is it still the right thing? You know, the idea that the ends justify the means isn't a very godly perspective. I mean, I think a better perspective is, if the ends are just, God will provide the means. These men have sworn to God that they will commit murder. 40 men to one. Are you sure you're doing the Lord's work right now? Now, of course, you probably, hopefully, will never be in a conspiracy to kill somebody, okay? But this question should loom in our minds when we think we're going to do the right thing, but the road to doing the right thing looks a little sketchy. Is this what God's asking me to do? There were plenty of times, I think, that Paul could have done sketchy stuff to escape persecution, right? And it'd have been easy to justify it, to say, well, no, I need to be free to preach the gospel. I mean, Peter's in prison, and the shackles fall off, and he could have got up and walked out. But he didn't. And that's a far cry from breaking the law, right? So, just as a sort of personal self-examination issue, I think this is a good call to us to remember. It's not just that we should have good ends in mind. We should also make sure that the path there, our means of getting there, is also godly. And if it isn't, maybe number one, we need to pray if we have pointed ourselves at the right ends. And number two, if he confirms that we have, then we need to pray that he'll provide a way. Because this ain't it. It gets worse. These 40 men reached out to whom for help? The chief priests and the elders. So now not only do you have a band of 40 murderers, they have made the chief priests conspirators in the murder. And you know what? They agree to do it. But hey, what do you expect? They killed Jesus. Right? Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. So he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and, going aside, asked him privately, "What is it you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they're ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one you have informed me of these things." Then he called two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night into Antipatris. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. I think we're going to stop there. I think we're going to stop there. All right, we'll pick up chapter 24 next week. The ball's going to roll pretty significantly faster in these next few weeks. As you can tell, we covered a whole chapter today. We might even go faster than that because, honestly, we're kind of just getting into what happens. So it's a little less, I hate to say this, but it's a little less doctrinally driven and a little bit more just understanding the story of what happens. So I think we're going to read bigger chunks. But anyways, thank you for sticking around. We're probably a few weeks out of finishing up Acts, which means if you have thoughts about what you would like our next Bible study series to be about, could be topical, could be a book of the Bible, I'm open to ideas. Think about it. Let me know. We got worship coming up in about 14 minutes, so stick around.